We picture the Wild West as a land without rules. That's a complete myth. The frontier was obsessed with laws, both the ones etched in law books and the unwritten codes that could get you shot. And they were often so bizarre they defy all logic. We're about to explore the most nonsensical of them all, revealing a side of history far stranger and frankly dumber than any Hollywood movie ever dared to show. 1. The saloon was the heart of the Wild West, a hyper-masculine world of sawdust, whiskey, and tobacco juice. And for decades, the floor was the universal spittoon. But as respectable women began to arrive, towns started passing laws that would change the saloon forever. It became illegal to spit on the floor. This wasn't about hygiene. It was about laundry. The new laws were enacted because women's long dresses were dragging through the muck. The most iconic institution of the frontier was finally tamed, not by sheriffs or preachers, but by the silently devastating power of a dry cleaning bill. 2. San Francisco desperately wanted to project an image of a sophisticated, civilized city, but it had a dark secret written directly into its law books. Starting in the 1860s, a series of statutes known as the Ugly Laws made it a crime to be, well, ugly in public. This wasn't just subtle social pressure. This was the city acting as the world's meanest bouncer at the club of public life. If you were maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed, you were breaking the law simply by being seen on the street. Your very existence in public was a misdemeanor. It's a chilling reminder that some frontiers were meant to be closed. 3. In the Wild West, you could get into trouble for cattle rustling, bank robbery, and for lazy gardening. In Pueblo, Colorado, it was a crime against the city to allow a dandelion to grow within the town limits. This wasn't a suggestion from a neighborhood association. It was a legally enforceable ordinance. You have to imagine a stern-faced lawman, the dandelion sheriff, patrolling the streets, not for outlaws but for rogue weeds. It shows a level of obsessive civic pride that is both admirable and completely insane. Forget bandits. The real threat to Pueblo's public order was aggressive pollination. 4. In Texas, it was illegal to shoot a buffalo from the second story of a hotel. Now, this wasn't an early, enlightened attempt at wildlife conservation. It was also illegal to shoot them from a moving train, and the real reason was infuriatingly corporate. So many passengers were blasting away from the windows in a hunting frenzy that the trains were constantly having to stop for them to collect their hides, completely wrecking the schedule. The law wasn't about preserving a majestic species, it was about preserving the timetable for the 315 to El Paso. The railroad always wins. 5. In the Wild West, property rights were sacred. But in Dodge City, Kansas, they took it a step further. A real city ordinance from the 1870s declared that no building could be erected if it obstructed a citizen's view of the southern horizon. Why the southern horizon? Because that was where the massive buffalo herds appeared. Think about that. Your right to watch the thundering spectacle of the hunt from your own front porch was legally protected. This wasn't just zoning, it was state-sponsored entertainment. In Dodge City, a front-row seat to the apocalypse was your legal right. 6. Picture the classic saloon scene. A dusty cowboy swaggers up to the bar, slams a coin down, and yells, "Around for my friends!" Well, in the Dakota Territory and other parts of the West, that very act of generosity was a crime. Real anti-treating laws made it illegal to buy another person an alcoholic drink. The goal was to combat the rampant public drunkenness and political bribery that often started when one person decided to treat the entire bar. It was a law that weaponized social awkwardness, forcing every man to buy his own drink. It turned the most celebrated gesture of frontier friendship into a finable offense. Suddenly, the most dangerous man in the saloon wasn't the gunslinger. It was the guy trying to be nice. 7. Imagine you're riding the trail and you stumble upon a body, a victim of a gunfight or the harsh elements. His gun looks brand new. His boots are barely worn. In the brutal calculus of survival, taking them seems logical. Except that simple act of, let's call it opportunistic recycling. was a specific and serious crime in many territories. Laws were enacted that made it a felony to remove personal effects, particularly boots and weapons, from a corpse. This wasn't a law about murder or robbery. It was a law against scavenging from the dead. It was a desperate attempt by civilization to draw a line in the sand, establishing that even in the most lawless of places, your property rights didn't end when your heartbeat did. 8. Imagine you just finished a 14-hour cattle drive. Your bones ache, you're covered in a half-inch of dust, and all you want is 5 minutes apiece. Well, in Galveston, Texas, if you sat down on the sidewalk to catch your breath, you'd be slapped with a $10 fine, a huge sum at the time. This was a blunt, anti-loitering law designed to keep undesirables from hanging around. Because nothing says, "Welcome to our thriving frontier town," like a complete and total ban on the act of sitting down. 9. We've covered laws born of practicality and prejudice, but this one from El Paso, Texas, is born of pure, baffling specificity. City Ordinance 357 made it illegal to publicly exhibit any contortions or other actions calculated to frighten, excite, or amuse any baby. Making a funny face at an infant could technically get you in trouble with the law. This wasn't about protecting children from harm. It was about policing public behavior at the most microscopic level. It's a law that makes you wonder what exactly was going on in El Paso. 10. The Wild West was a place of rugged survival and backbreaking work. But for women, the fashion police of the Victorian era were never far behind. In numerous frontier towns, it was illegal for a woman to wear male attire, which specifically meant pants. Imagine trying to herd cattle, chop wood, or defend your homestead from rattlesnakes while wearing a corset and a massive skirt. This wasn't just impractical, it was a law designed to keep women in their place, even when their place was a mud-soaked ranch miles from civilization. 11. In the rough-and-tumble town of Deadwood, South Dakota, a person's honor was everything. But their vocabulary? That came with a price tag. A well-documented city ordinance made public profanity a finable offense. This wasn't just a general rule against being rude. It was a literal profanity tax. You could curse all you wanted, as long as you were prepared to pay the city for the privilege. It transformed swearing from a moral failing into a simple financial transaction. In Deadwood, you could literally put your money where your mouth was. 12. Tombstone, Arizona is famous for the OK Corral, a shootout that happened precisely because of a town law. Ordinance number 9 made it illegal for any person to carry a deadly weapon within the city limits. Upon arriving, you had to check your firearms at a hotel or livery stable. Think about that. The most legendary gunfighters in history had to go through a process as mundane as a coat check before they could grab a drink. This law wasn't about rights. It was about survival. It was a city's desperate and ultimately futile attempt to manage the deadly egos of the men who walked its streets. 13. Some laws you can understand just by imagining the smell that created them. In the booming cattle town of Fort Worth, Texas, a city ordinance made it illegal to skin a skunk within the city limits. This wasn't about animal cruelty or public health in the traditional sense. It was about olfactory warfare. You just know this law was passed a day after some trapper decided his front porch was the ideal spot for his pungent line of work, rendering an entire city block uninhabitable for a week. This wasn't just a law, it was a community's desperate plea for breathable air. 14. In the Wild West, anyone could call themselves a doctor. Let me repeat that. There were virtually no laws requiring medical licensing or formal training. The man setting your broken leg might have been a bartender last week and a failed prospector the week before that. This terrifying lack of regulation meant that snake oil wasn't just a figure of speech. It was often the most advanced medicine you could find. The dumbest law in this case was the one that didn't exist, creating a medical free-for-all where the only qualification you needed to perform surgery was a strong stomach and a steady hand. 15. In an effort to curb drunken rowdiness, Leadville, Colorado, passed a surprisingly broad law. It was illegal to throw missiles at any building or person. The beauty is in the wonderfully vague term missiles. This could mean a rock, a bottle, or an empty can. But it could also technically mean a snowball, a water balloon, or a poorly aimed apple core. The law didn't care about intent or damage. It just banned the act of unauthorized throwing. It was a city ordinance desperately trying to outlaw bad decisions. 16. In the Wild West, dying was easy. Getting buried, however, could be surprisingly complicated, especially if you died in a booming mining town like Bodie, California. Real city ordinances often strictly forbade burying the dead within the town limits. But the reason wasn't sanitation or a respectful desire to create a quiet cemetery. It was pure, unfiltered greed. Every square foot of ground was considered too valuable for prospecting to be wasted on a corpse. Your eternal rest was literally less important than the possibility of a few more ounces of silver beneath your coffin. It was the ultimate expression of frontier capitalism. A town so obsessed with finding treasure in the ground, it refused to put any in. 17. In the West, you could be forgiven for many things, but insulting a woman's honor was not one of them. While not always a written law, the unwritten law of the West often gave a man the legal and social right to use violence to defend the honor of a female relative. If someone slandered your wife or daughter, you could shoot them, and a jury of your peers would almost certainly acquit you. It was a terrifying, informal legal code that placed a woman's reputation on a pedestal and a man's right to kill to protect it right alongside. 18. Cheating at cards in a saloon was a good way to get shot. But in some towns, it was also a good way to get arrested. Places like Denver had explicit laws making it a misdemeanor to cheat in any game of chance. The punishment was usually a fine far less severe than the frontier justice you'd get from the person you cheated. This law created a fascinating choice for a discovered cheater. Do you take your chances with the sheriff or with the 250-pound miner whose money you just tried to steal? It was a law that offered a slightly better outcome than a bullet. 19. Nothing captured the simmering tension between ranchers and homesteaders better than a very simple law. It was illegal to leave a gate open. In vast, fenced-in territories, a single open gate could mean a rancher's entire herd would wander off, or a homesteader's crops would be devoured by stray cattle. It was the ultimate passive-aggressive crime of the frontier. Prosecuting it was nearly impossible. But the law existed as a constant reminder that the greatest threat wasn't an outlaw with a gun, but a neighbor with a bad memory. 20. Oklahoma law had a provision making it illegal to tie a fish to a horse's tether with the specific intent of frightening the animal. This is one of those rules that just stops your brain. Let's break it down. Who was doing this? Was fish-based equine terrorism a common prank? Was there a gang of outlaws who specialized in this bizarre form of psychological warfare against horses? The mind reels at the very specific series of bad decisions that led a group of lawmakers to decide this was the problem that absolutely needed to be solved. 21. Picture a weary cowboy riding into a sun-scorched Texas town. He spots the only sign of life in the oppressive heat: a lonely, struggling shade tree on Main Street. The logical move is to tie his horse to it, right? Wrong. In many of these nascent towns, that very act was illegal. Trees were so rare, so precious, and often so painstakingly imported that they were considered vital municipal assets. And since horses had a destructive habit of chewing the bark, towns passed ordinances specifically forbidding anyone from hitching their horse to a public tree. It was the ultimate frontier irony, a law that made it clear the town's single patch of shade was more valuable than your horse. 22. Dueling was the West's most famous and fatal method of conflict resolution. And while it was often illegal, the most interesting laws weren't about the duel itself. They were about the prelude. In many territories, it was a specific crime to send or accept a challenge to a duel. Lawmakers knew they couldn't stop two determined men from shooting each other, but they could try to outlaw the formal invitation. It was a law that targeted not the violence, but the etiquette that led to it. 23. The railroad was the undisputed king of the West, and it wrote the laws to prove it. In cattle country, a common statute made it a crime to herd your livestock across railroad tracks at any point other than a designated public crossing. This sounds reasonable until you realize that on the vast, open range, the nearest public crossing could be 50 miles away. It was a law that completely ignored the reality of a cattle drive, forcing cowboys to choose between a 3-day detour or breaking the law. It was a perfect example of corporate power dressed up as public safety. 24. In the West, getting cold feet before a wedding wasn't just awkward, it was a potential financial catastrophe. The legal concept of breach of promise to marry was taken very seriously. If a man promised to marry a woman and then backed out, she could sue him for damages. And juries, often sympathetic to the jilted bride, would award massive sums. This wasn't about love, it was a business contract. A man's word was his bond, especially when that bond was a potential marriage license that could be converted into cash in a courtroom. 25. Long before the invention of the automobile, the Wild West had to deal with its first traffic menace, the reckless horse and buggy driver. In cities like Cheyenne, Wyoming, real speed limits were enacted, making it illegal to ride or drive a horse faster than a moderate trot through the main streets. The fine could be up to $100, an astronomical sum. This was the birth of traffic law, a city's attempt to rein in the timeless human urge to go just a little bit faster than everyone else, even when your vehicle is powered by hay. 26. In the vast, open ranges of the West, a cow's brand was more important than the cow itself. It was a corporate logo, a legal signature, and a declaration of ownership all burned into hide. Consequently, the laws against altering a brand were draconian. While stealing a calf might get you in trouble, being caught with a running iron, a tool used to change one brand into another, was often a hanging offense, with or without a trial. It was the frontier's version of corporate identity theft, and the punishment was absolute. 27. Forget horse races and card games. The biggest gamble in the Wild West was often the next election. Saloon patrons wouldn't just argue about who should be the next mayor, they would slam their life savings on the table to back it up. This turned civic duty into a high-stakes poker game, and lawmakers realized it was a terrible idea. So many territories flat-out outlawed betting on elections. The reasoning was simple and brutal. A man who has bet his entire ranch on a candidate's victory is no longer a voter. He's an investor with a very clear incentive to ensure his guy wins, whether by stuffing the ballot box, intimidating opponents, or worse. It was a rare moment of clarity where lawmakers admitted that a bag of silver could easily outweigh a belief in democracy. 28. In most Western towns, you were either a resident or you were just passing through. And the law treated you very, very differently. Draconian vagrancy laws were common, making it a crime to be unemployed and without a permanent address. This gave sheriffs immense power to arrest anyone who looked poor, suspicious, or simply didn't belong. It was a legal tool for social cleansing, a way to keep the undesirable element moving on. The most dangerous crime you could commit in these towns wasn't robbery. It was failing to prove you had a good reason to be there. 29. In a land defined by its lack of water, the rules governing it were a matter of life and death. The guiding principle was prior appropriation, or first in time, first in right. This meant the first person to use water from a stream for a beneficial use owned the rights to it forever. This led to the absurd spectacle of ranchers literally racing each other to be the first to dig a ditch from a newly discovered creek. Your entire fortune could depend not on hard work, but on whether you woke up 10 minutes earlier than your neighbor one Tuesday morning. 30. In the West, a man's best friend often came with a tax bill. Many towns, struggling for revenue, instituted a dog tax. The laws were often surprisingly detailed, with a higher tax for female dogs than for males, in a crude attempt to control the canine population. Imagine a grizzled cowboy, who fears no man, having to sheepishly visit the town clerk to pay a $2 tax on his loyal cattle dog, Scraps, It was the long, bureaucratic arm of the law, reaching into the one relationship a man thought was truly free. 31. In the rapidly growing cities of the West, fresh milk was a precious commodity. It was also quite often a complete lie. With no regulation, it was common practice for dairymen to stretch their supply with water, chalk for color, and even molasses to hide the taste. The problem got so bad that places like Denver passed laws specifically making it a crime to sell adulterated or unwholesome milk. This wasn't just a truth in advertising law. It was a city's desperate attempt to stop its citizens from unknowingly drinking a cocktail of paint, sugar, and whatever else was lying around the barn. 32. While the West was a supposed land of opportunity, it was built on a foundation of brutal, legally enforced racism. One of the most widespread laws was the complete ban on selling alcohol or firearms to Native Americans. But here's the truly cynical part. This law was almost never about protecting anyone. It was a tool of control, selectively enforced to keep the native population at a disadvantage, yet frequently ignored by unscrupulous traders when there was a profit to be made. It was a law that managed to be both catastrophically destructive and breathtakingly hypocritical at the same time. 33. Imagine a gold rush. Now, imagine that to legally claim your patch of land, you had to perform a specific, backbreaking, and often pointless ritual. That was the reality under the discovery shaft rule. To make a mining claim official, a prospector was legally required to dig a hole at least 10 feet deep on their plot. This was meant to prove that they were serious, but it led to the absurd landscape of mountainsides pockmarked with thousands of identical 10-foot deep holes, most of them containing nothing but dirt and shattered dreams. It was the world's most exhausting and least effective filing system. 34. You think of the Wild West as a place of chaos, where even adults were untamed. But many towns were surprisingly strict with their children. By the 1880s, towns from Prescott to Cheyenne had enacted strict curfew laws, often requiring anyone under the age of 16 to be off the streets by 8 or 9 p.m. The irony is staggering. While gunfights could break out in the saloons and fortunes could be lost on a single hand of poker, the city council's most pressing concern was making sure little Jimmy wasn't out past his bedtime. It was a bizarre attempt to impose order on the next generation while the current one was still shooting at the saloon piano. 35. Life in a frontier town was an assault on the senses, but nothing quite compared to the pigs. In many burgeoning western cities, including Los Angeles, it was perfectly legal for pigs to roam the streets freely, acting as a sort of organic garbage disposal. This led to a very real and very smelly problem. So, towns passed ordinances making it illegal for a citizen to own a pig unless it was kept in a pen. This wasn't a public health initiative. It was a declaration of war against the four-legged trash compactors that were turning Main Street into a mud pit. 36. As the West grew, so did its prejudices. In San Francisco, a city ordinance in the 1870s placed a special tax on laundries that didn't use horse-drawn carriages for their deliveries. This may sound random, but it was a targeted attack on Chinese laundry owners, who were known for delivering clothes by carrying them on foot with bamboo poles. Laundries owned by white proprietors, which used wagons, were exempt. It was a law that didn't mention race at all, but its intent was crystal clear. 37. As dusty frontier outposts tried to rebrand themselves as respectable communities, they waged a holy war against Sunday fun. It wasn't just about closing saloons. Ordinances across the West made it illegal for theaters to hold performances, for stores to sell anything but absolute necessities, and, in many cases, for anyone to play baseball on the Sabbath. This created a silent, surreal landscape every Sunday, a forced day of piety in towns that were, for the other 6 days of the week, temples of vice and chaos. It was a legal battle between Saturday night and Sunday morning, and Sunday morning had the law on its side. 38. We've talked about water rights, but the system's true absurdity lay in one simple principle: use it or lose it. Under territorial law, if you owned the rights to a certain amount of river water but didn't use all of it, you could forfeit your claim to the unused portion. This led to the utterly insane practice of ranchers and farmers wastefully flooding empty fields or digging ditches that went nowhere, just to prove they were using their full water allotment. It was a system that legally required you to waste a precious resource in order to keep it. 39. A person's final resting place is supposed to be sacred, unless, of course, that person was a Chinaman in 19th century California. A horrifyingly real state law from 1870, known as the Disinterment Ordinance, made it illegal to dig up a corpse without a permit. This was aimed directly at the Chinese community, who held a deep cultural belief in shipping the bones of their dead back to their homeland for final burial. The permits were, of course, prohibitively expensive, making this a cruel and targeted law designed to attack a community's most sacred traditions, even after death. 40. The telegraph was the 19th century's internet, a fragile wire connecting lonely outposts to civilization. And messing with it was a cardinal sin. In virtually every Western territory, it was a felony to damage a telegraph line. The punishment was often years of hard labor, potentially more than you'd get for robbing a stagecoach. This wasn't a law against simple vandalism. Tampering with that single strand of copper was seen as an attack on progress itself, a treasonous act that could isolate a whole community. It was the one piece of technology you simply did not mess with. 41. The romantic image of the Wild West is all dust and rugged individualism. But some towns decided to attack that image directly, with a bar of soap. In various frontier communities trying to become civilized, ordinances were passed requiring residents, particularly men, to take a bath at least once a month. Imagine a sheriff's duties, not just arresting outlaws, but conducting olfactory investigations. Sir, I have a warrant for your arrest, and a recommendation for some lye soap. This wasn't just about public health. It was a declaration of war against the cowboy's sacred right to smell like he'd been sleeping inside a cow for a week. It was the ultimate frontier showdown, personal liberty versus public air quality. 42. The single greatest enemy of daily life in a Western town wasn't an outlaw. It was dust. The relentless, choking dust got into everything. To combat this, towns like Tombstone enacted street sprinkling ordinances. These laws legally required every business owner and resident to water the section of dirt road in front of their property at least twice a day. This wasn't a friendly suggestion. It was a legally mandated twice-daily war against airborne dirt, fought with buckets and barrels. Your civic duty was measured in how much mud you could create. 43. The red and white barber pole seems like a harmless classic symbol. But in the 19th century, it was a very public reminder that your barber was also the town's surgeon, a man of razors, scissors, and very questionable medical theories. As frontier towns desperately tried to rebrand themselves as sophisticated cities, this relic of a cruder time was bad for business. So they passed ordinances banning the poles, deeming them offensive to public decency. Think about the sheer absurdity. In a town where a gunfight might break out at any moment, the real threat to civic order was a striped pole's historical implications. 44. In wooden boom towns built practically overnight, the greatest killer wasn't a bullet. It was a stray spark. The fear of fire was so all-consuming that it led to hyper-specific laws. In many towns, it was illegal to have a stovepipe that passed through a roof or wall without being at least 5 inches away from any wood. Imagine a town marshal, whose job included facing down outlaws, also having to carry a measuring tape to conduct chimney inspections. It was a law born from the terrifying knowledge that one lazy carpenter could wipe the entire town off the map before breakfast. 45. In a transient society, skipping out on your hotel bill was a common problem. To combat this, territories passed innkeeper laws that were surprisingly cunning. These statutes stated that if a person left a hotel without paying and without offering a good reason, the law would automatically presume they intended to commit fraud. The burden of proof was flipped. You weren't innocent until proven guilty. You were a swindler until you could prove you just forgot. It was a legal shortcut to stop the endless stream of dine and dash cowboys. 46. Life was hard, and sometimes a man just wanted to hear some music, but not from an organ grinder. These itinerant musicians, often with a monkey in tow, were seen as a public nuisance. In response, towns like Butte, Montana, passed laws requiring them to buy an incredibly expensive license to perform, often $25 a month, a fortune at the time. This wasn't regulation, it was a financial banishment, a law designed to make sure the only music you heard on the street was the sound of spurs and saloon pianos. 47. We think of the Wild West as a place with no rules, but even then, they drew a line at selling certain products to kids. Long before nationwide bans, many Western towns had ordinances making it illegal to sell tobacco or cigarettes to anyone under the age of 16. It's a shocking moment of public health foresight in an era defined by whiskey and gun smoke. Even in the most lawless places, they understood that some vices should at least wait until you were old enough to shave. 48. With thousands of horses, cattle, and mules packed into dusty towns, the inevitable happened. Animals died. And they died right there in the street. This led to brutally practical sanitation laws. In most towns, it was illegal for the owner of a dead animal to leave its carcass on a public street for more than 24 hours. The penalty was a stiff fine for each day the corpse remained. It was a law that created a very specific and very smelly deadline for every resident. 49. In the Wild West, getting justice was often a race against time. So much so that in the earliest gold rush camps, they legally banned the one thing that slows the legal process down the most: lawyers. That's not an exaggeration. In the highly effective, if informal, miners' courts, professional attorneys were often explicitly forbidden from speaking. Justice was decided on the spot by a committee of fellow miners who valued first-hand accounts and common sense above all else. Lawyers were seen as professional tricksters who would use confusing language and legal loopholes to obstruct the simple truth. It was a legal system built on the radical belief that the best way to find the truth was to kick the experts out of the room. All right, we've covered 49 points with just one grand finale left. But before we get to number 50, it's time for the final verdict. In our opinion, the award for the most mind-bogglingly dumb law on this list goes to Oklahoma's ban on tying a fish to a horse's tether to frighten it, simply because it is a solution to a problem that no sane human mind could have ever conceived of. Do you agree with our verdict? Or did another law deserve this dubious honor? Let us know what you think in the comments. And now, for our final number. 50. Think of the most harmless, innocent pastime imaginable. Something a child would do on a breezy afternoon. Flying a kite, perhaps. Well, in numerous frontier towns, that simple joy was a public menace and an illegal act. Real ordinances banned kite flying within the city limits, not because they were a distraction, but because they were a direct threat to the entire transportation system. The unpredictable, fluttering object in the sky was a silent predator to the equine nervous system, capable of turning a perfectly calm horse into a bolting, wagon-flipping instrument of chaos. The Wild West was a place where a six-shooter on your hip was perfectly normal, but a child's toy in the sky was a threat to public safety. So there you have it. The Wild West wasn't lawless. It was just governed by an alien logic we can barely comprehend. The line between civilization and chaos was drawn with some of the most bizarre rules ever invented. But this all leads to a dangerous question. Which one of these absurd laws would you actually bring back today? Be honest in the comments. If you enjoy history that challenges you, prove it. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that defy the official narrative.